Today we'll be building this random quote generator app with Next.js, PlanetScale's serverless MySQL platform, and Drizzle ORM for maximum type safety while working with our SQL database. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today we'll be using PlanetScale's serverless MySQL, Drizzle ORM, and Next.js. And I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. We're starting today at planetscale.com, and you can see their website says they're the world's most advanced serverless MySQL platform. Now, this is not a sponsored video in any way, but I did want to highlight using PlanetScale because I've found it to be very cool and efficient. So let's go ahead and click sign in. Now, if we don't have an account at all, you can just sign up for an account with GitHub. It's just as simple as already having a GitHub login and signing in. But if you do want to set up an email and password, you can do that as well. I'm just going to use, or here is the actual sign up for an account. And I believe, yep, there's continue with GitHub. So that's what I was talking about. I already have an account, so I'm going to sign in. And I'm just going to use GitHub as well. And then I'll be in my dashboard. And you can see I don't have any database set up here right now. So that's what we're going to do. Now, before we get started, I want to say if you're not already familiar with SQL or an SQL database, I've got a video on my channel about that. I'm going to link to that in the description. And I'm also going to give a link to something PlanetScale provides. They have a nice little SQL course that you can work through as well. And it's got some great fundamentals in there. So I'll put both of those links in the description. Right now, we want to go ahead and create a new database. So that's what we're going to do. Come up with a name here. I'm going to say quotes DB and click create database. So we can see the database is initializing, and I'll come back when this is finished. Okay, the database has completed initializing, and you can see now it says load balancer, and it has the primary listed here. We're in development, as you also see on the page. Now we're going to go to the console for the database. We're on branch main as well, and we just click connect, and now we have a live console where we can issue SQL commands. Once again, I'm going to highlight, if you're not familiar with SQL, you should be looking at those resources that I've provided in the description, because everything I'm about to do won't make much sense if you don't know SQL already. So we're going to need 3 tables for our database to power our random quote machine. I want a table for authors, a table for categories, and then a table for quotes. So let's go ahead and create the first table, and that's for authors. So I'm going to say create table, and then I'll put lowercase authors as the name of the table, a parentheses. Let me go down to the next line now, and I'll just tab over just a little bit here and say ID, and then it's going to be an integer, and then it's going to be not null, also auto increment, and then we'll make it a primary key. After that, we're also going to have an author, and here this is going to be a varchar, is what I would say, which is a variable character, and it's going to allow 255 characters, not null, and it will be unique because we don't want duplicate authors in our table. After that, enter one more time in a parentheses, and always in this console, we need to end with a semicolon or it won't think we have completed the commands here. So we're just creating a table with 2 columns. We have an ID and an author column. So I'm going to press enter, and it should complete. Yes, it did very quickly. And we now have an authors table. Now I'm going to add the command here rather quickly for the category table because it's identical to what we had above. I'm just calling this categories. And then notice we have a category column here. So I'm going to enter this as well. And now we have our categories table. Jumping back to the browser and the PlanetScale documentation quickly, I just wanted to highlight before we go ahead and create the quotes table that PlanetScale does not support foreign key constraints. And we were going to have foreign keys if we set up a traditional MySQL database because the author ID that we list in the quotes table would be a foreign key from that author table that would have the ID, and the same for categories. So we would have 2 foreign keys in our quotes table traditionally. But what we do have with PlanetScale is the use of relationships as shown in the example above. So just highlight here that they have a categories table in this example, and then they have a products table. And now here they're saying this key, they're creating an index, category ID IDX, which is just an abbreviation for index, and then saying category ID that is right here. So that's how they're handling kind of the foreign key relationship, and it relates back to the ID in categories. So we're going to do the same thing as we create the quotes table. Back in the console for our quotes DB, I'm going to put in the command to create the quotes table. Now let's break this down. We have an ID that is just like the ID column we had in each of these other tables. Then we have the quote itself, which is just like the other information, either the author or the category from those tables. And then we have a couple of other things. Here we have the author ID and the category ID. And we're handling these because these would be foreign keys, just like they show in the docs here, where we say key, we create an author ID index, and we pass in author ID. The same for the category ID index. And that's how we're going to relate these back to these other tables. So now I'll press enter, and we've created all three tables for our quotes DB. So now we can just type show tables, and I want to use all caps, as I usually do. And then we're going to show all three tables. Now we don't have any data in those tables yet, but at least we can see we have indeed created all three tables. Now let's quickly put some data into our database and the tables that are associated with it. So I'm going to say insert into authors, and then we're going to insert into that author column because our ID will automatically be added and it will be auto incremented as we add more data. And we'll say values, and the value we're going to pass here, our first author of a quote will be Neil deGrasse Tyson. And now put the semicolon so it knows we're finished and press enter, and it inserted that record. So now we should be able to select that data and say select all from authors, and we get our table back that has the ID and the author. So there is our authors table currently. So now I'm going to put in a similar command to insert some data here for categories. I'm creating the knowledge-learning category, and I'll enter that, and it's now inserted that data. We could select everything from categories as well, so you could do the same as we did from authors if you want to see that. I'm going to go ahead and insert a quote as well, and those IDs, of course, need to relate back to the authors and the categories tables. So we're going to say author ID of 1 and category ID of 1 as we put in these values. So let's take a quick look. We're putting in the quote, the author ID, and the category ID. So we have our quote, and then we have 1 for the author ID and 1 for the category ID. And now we've inserted that as well. Now go ahead and run select statements on these tables after you insert data, just to confirm you've inserted the data. Now I'm going to go ahead and insert about 4 more quotes and authors, and then I'll come back just so we have a little more data to work with in this tutorial. I'm back, and I've inserted the extra quotes and authors and even 1 more category. So now let's just do a select all from quotes, and we should be able to see all of our quotes here in the table. So there's our quotes, and this is how they relate to the authors and how they relate to the categories. So in our app, our Next.js app, we will be using Drizzle ORM to go ahead and query this data. But right now we can write a traditional SQL query that we will replicate with Drizzle to select the data we want. And it's going to have a couple of inner joins because we have these 3 tables. And we won't want all the data from the tables. We just want the actual quote, author, and category. So let's go ahead and write this query that we would use to get the data we want in the application. So here I'm going to say select all from a.author, c.category, and q.quote. I'll come down to the next line and say from quotes, and that table will be referred to as Q, as we've already seen. Then I'll say inner join, and we're going to join authors, and this would be A, on Q dot author underscore ID equals A dot ID. Now we'll have a similar inner join here for categories, which was C on, and this would be Q dot, Sorry, I'm getting my caps mixed up. q.category_id equals c.id. Now that should be the full query to give us what we want. So let's go ahead and press enter and see what our output is. This is what we want to work with. So we're going to get the author back and the category and the quote. And this would be the actual quote record that we would want to work with in the application. And we have 5 of those to go ahead and work with today, especially if you like the dude from The Big Lebowski. Now we're still in development mode here, so let's go back up to the top. Well, we're in a different frame here. Remember, we have the console frame here, and then on the outside, we have the outer frame here. So we could come to the console or back to our overview. And we want to go back to the overview here. Now click the gear over here by development. We're ready to promote our branch to production. So I'm going to click promote branch. And now I want to go ahead and click here again, I believe. Let me check that. Yes, we want to toggle enable safe migrations, and then click enable safe migrations as well. And now if we scroll down just a little bit, we see this button that says get connection strings, and we are going to need this. So let's go ahead and click this. We could open it up now and then just find what we want in a little bit. Oh, we need a password to go along with the rest. So we have create a name, or it says create a password, and here it has name. This is on branch main. We are an admin, so I guess this would be our password that it's asking for. So I'm going to go ahead and Control C to copy this over into just a text file somewhere on my computer so I don't lose it. And I'll go ahead and click create password to see if that's what it does. Says it created the password. And it looks like that was a password identifier, because here is what we need to access our application. And of course, I'm going to delete this database later, so no point in using mine, but this is showing how you will get yours as well, which should be different than mine. Now, right now, this is showing how to connect with Node.js. We will need this later as well, and we can come back to this when we do need it. Right now, I'm interested in going to the @PlanetScale/database. We're going to use these. So if you want to go ahead and copy these and save them in a text file as well, you can do that, or we can come back and get them as we need to add them to our .env.local file in the Next.js application. So I'm going to go ahead and copy them right now so I don't necessarily have to come back. And so we've got our database host, database username, database password. All 3 of these you will need. And if you ever needed to change your password, the new password button is up here as well. But now that we have that, we are good to go. So let's go to VS Code and create our Next.js application. I'm in VS Code and I have a terminal window open. I am ready to create my project inside my Next folder already. So here I'm going to say npx create-next-app, and I am going to use the latest. However, if you're following this tutorial at a later time, make sure to check my package.json file to see which version I'm using, because Next.js changes things frequently, and if you want to follow along and not have any errors possibly, or just know that you're using the same version I am, it's going to be best that you check my package.json, and we can look at that here after it creates the application as well, just so I could announce which version I'm using today. So it says I need to install the following packages, and it's going to be 13.4.6 today. I don't even need to look at the package. It's going to tell me right there. So just press enter to say yes, do that. And so let's call this our quotes DB project, and we'll press enter. Yes for TypeScript, yes for ESLint, yes for Tailwind, yes for the source directory, yes for the app router. No need to customize the default import alias. We will be using an import alias, but I don't need to customize it. So now it's going to go ahead and create the new Next.js project. And now VS Code has completed creating the project, and I've gone ahead and opened the quotes DB folder that it created now. So I'm inside that folder, and we need to create a .env.local file. So let's just do that, and I'll highlight something here in the root like the tsconfig. Then create a new file, which is .env.local. Now let's paste in those environment variables that we got from PlanetScale. So we have our database host, our database username and database password. I'll press Alt-Z just so we can see everything there. We want to make sure we have all three of these values in that .env.local. Now, as I mentioned, let me go to the package.json file and we can confirm that I am using Next.js 13.4.6 today. So if you want to install the exact version that I have, you could go ahead and create the Next app at latest if you want to, and then just come back and go npm I, and then of course you'd want to say next at 13.4.6 to match what I have. And now we're back in the browser and we're at Drizzle ORM, which is actually orm.drizzle.team. And they've got a pretty good sense of humor if you look at some of the things on the website, especially if you scroll down here to the reviews under developers love Drizzle ORM. I got a kick out of that. Check those out. So after that, it's explaining what it is up here at the top. But an ORM, let's talk about that first. If you're not familiar, that's an object relational mapping, and it's a way to align programming code with database structures. So we're not going to write just our traditional SQL language inside of our code. We're going to use this ORM, and this one really emphasizes TypeScript, which is great. It adds what they say is maximum type safety in mind as they created it, or maximum type safety to our code. So let's go ahead and go to the documentation and see how we can get started with Drizzle. Now, this is for Postgres, this first example they're giving us here. So that's not necessarily what we want because we're going to use PlanetScale under MySQL today. So let's go ahead and click that. And now we see what we need to install here. It looks like we're going to install drizzle-orm. Then we're going to go ahead and install that PlanetScale/database JavaScript client that it has. And then under a development dependency, which is what the -D is, we're going to install drizzle-kit also. So you can click the copy code over here. Now let's go back to VS Code. Back in VS Code, we need to open a terminal window, and then I'm in Windows, so the things I have copied, I can just right click and it pastes it in, and it starts running the installation here for Drizzle ORM and the PlanetScale/database client. But then we're going to have one other line to install here, which is npm I-D for development drizzle-kit, and I need to go ahead and press enter on that, and it will install that as well. Now there's one other development dependency we're going to need today, and I'm only going to use it in development, so I'm going to just install it while we're here. So I'll say npm I, and then it is .env, and then I'll put -D once again to make it a development dependency. So let's quickly install this. That was fast. We'll close this, and now let's look at our package JSON. So we have the Drizzle ORM here, we have the PlanetScale database up here at the top, and under dev dependencies we have .env and drizzle-kit. We are back in our PlanetScale here where we were getting our information, and we need to get that Node.js connection string now as well. So from this drop-down menu, instead of the PlanetScale/database, let's choose Node.js. And now let's go ahead and click the copy here as well. We'll go back to VS Code and make this an environment variable in our environment variable file as well. And back in VS Code, let's go to that .env.local. And now underneath this, I'm going to paste in the new environment variable. Notice it says database_URL. So we want to make sure that's what we reference in our code when we use it. Now we need to create a config file for Drizzle. So again, at this root level, let's create a new file, and it's going to be drizzle.config.ts. The name is important because this is what Drizzle defaults to if you don't pass the name of the file. So it's best to just name it this, drizzle.config.ts. Now let's go ahead and create this file. First, we're going to import type, and this type is config. And that is going to come from drizzle-kit. There we go. After that one, we're going to import .env from .env. And then we're going to say .env.config. And now we're going to pass a configuration here. And I'm going to say path, because we're not just using the .env file, we're using .env.local. So we're just telling .env specifically where the file is that has the environment variables. Now we'll say, whoops, I did not mean to bring that parentheses down. Now we'll come down after that and we'll say export default, put our curly brace. Now we'll say where the schema is going to be, and this is going to be in source, and then we'll say DB. We'll make a DB folder shortly after this. And then any file inside that DB folder could be a schema file. After that, let's say out, and here we'll say it will be /drizzle, so it will create a drizzle folder when we use that. And now we need our connection string. This is going to be process.env.database_URL. And then at the very end of this, we want to say satisfies config. And now we should have appeased TypeScript as well. And before we move on, I've just shown you how you could read multiple schemas from the same file, but we're only going to have one today. This means any file in that DB folder. We're just going to have one, and I'm going to name it schema.ts. So you can specify just one as well. We could easily create one file for each table. We've got 3 tables, but they'll all be in one file today. So I'll just leave it specifically to that one file. I may want to put something else in that same DB folder, for example. So I'll specify what it is. You could also provide an array, if I remember correctly, and then specify each file path as a string for each schema also. Now let's go ahead and create that DB directory inside of our source directory. So now I'll go ahead and create that there. And we will add the schema soon, but actually Drizzle is going to generate it for us. So let's go to our package.json, and we can set up an introspect process, and that means Drizzle will go ahead and look at our database at PlanetScale, so it will connect to it with the values we've provided, and then it will introspect and get information about that database and actually create the types for us, which is pretty cool. So here in the package.json, let's add our introspect line under scripts. I'll say introspect. And now for the command, we're going to say drizzle-kit and then introspect : we'll say MySQL. Now that said, the output, as we put in our config, will go into this new Drizzle folder, this Drizzle directory that it will create. So let's open up the terminal, and then we can say npm run introspect, and it should run this process as it connects to our database. It did it fast too. So it said 3 tables fetched, 8 columns fetched, 5 indexes, 0 foreign keys, because PlanetScale, remember, doesn't really support foreign keys, it supports relationships. Then it created an SQL migration file, and it created a schema for us, the schema.ts, that it's inside the Drizzle folder. So let's scroll up and look at our new Drizzle folder and see what's inside. You also see this meta directory where you'll find a couple of things, a JSON file and a possibly another JSON file. Let's take a look at that as well. I'll close this. Yes, a small one here that's a journal. So I think it journals every time you run that. After that, let's look at this one. And yes, it's got a lot of details in here about our database. That's just a snapshot. So now what we're interested in is, here's the SQL file. Notice it's all commented out. So we don't need to run this. This matches what we already have. But if you were to issue all of the commands, this is how you would recreate your database, and it's cool that it just generated that for us. Likewise, here's our schema in the schema.ts. Now, I said I'm going to put this in that DB directory we created, but notice it's got the full amount right here. I'll say Alt-Z just to wrap this down. It's imported a few things maybe by default that we're not using, I can see, but overall, this is pretty cool because it just created everything for us. And this really shows us how Drizzle works. It likes to chain these different things, but it's applying the same things that you saw we applied with our traditional SQL as we used the PlanetScale console. So here is the quotes table schema. Here's the categories schema, and you can see the unique index here as well. And here is the author schema. So what I'm going to do is just Control A to copy all of this, and then, well, Control A to select, Control C to copy, and then I will scroll down to this database directory, and I'll create a new file here that is named the same, schema.ts, and then Control V to just paste it all in. Now, we just used Introspect. Drizzle is also capable of migrations. So say you would make a change to your schema, then you wanted to send that back to the database and have those changes take place. You can do all of that with Drizzle as well, and I'm not doing that today, but you could dive into the docs and check that out because it's not much more difficult than what you just saw me do with Introspect. And Drizzle will also let you infer types from your model. So this, or schema or model, whichever you want to call it really, but it's our schema. You could infer from that, and it's called, I said model, because what it's called that you import from Drizzle is called infer model to get your type. But we don't want the type of any specific schema because remember, our quote is going to use joins, and we're going to get specific data from each table. I said our quote, I meant our query that we're going to use is really going to pull the quote out of this table. It's going to pull the category out of this table and the author out of this table. So it's that join data. So we're going to need to create our own type for that. And to do that, let's go down here to the root area once again and create a types.d.ts file. And now let's create a simple type that is called quote, and it's going to equal this object over here that has a quote that is a string, and it's going to have an author that is a string, and it's going to have a category that is a string. And that will be our main type for the data we expect to get back. Now back in our source directory, we need to create another directory, and we can call it lib for library, and it's going to create or contain some library functions. And we're going to create two REST API endpoints today, as well as our front end that displays a random quote each time. And we want to use these library functions for both, so we can get data when we are using a server component in Next.js, or we can get data, of course, once again, the code for the routes that we would use for that API are also in the server. So we can get data from either one of those. So there's no reason to create two different functions that are identical. Let's just create one library function and use it in both places. So let's create our first function here inside our lib directory. I'm going to call it get all quotes.ts. Now I need to import connect, and this is going to come from at PlanetScale database. There we go. After that, we also need to import config, and that's going to come from our at db, and then we have our schema. That's where our config is, but we don't have that config file yet. That's right, I need to create that. So let's quickly add this config file here as well, and then we'll come back to this function. So here I'm going to create a new file, name it config.ts. This is a very simple file, and it uses our other environment variables. So we'll just say export const config. Then inside of this, we'll say host, and this will be process.env.database_host. And now I'm just going to do Shift Alt and the down arrow to copy that down twice, and we'll change what we need to change here. So instead of host now, I'm going to press, well, I highlight the first host, then Control D to select the second. And because of an extension I have, it's going to honor these caps and lowercase when I type. So here I can just say username, and this one stays lowercase and this one stays uppercase. That extension, I have a YouTube short on it, is called multi-case cursor preserve, if I remember correctly. Search for that, and if it's not the accurate name, it's going to be very close, but I believe it is multi-case cursor preserve. And that allows you to select one, then I press Control D to select the next one, and I can type password, and it keeps this one lowercase and this one uppercase just as they were. So you can see it preserves the case. And that's all there is to the config file. So now let's go back to our get all quotes library function. And I just noticed I typed schema up here. This should be from config, and then it's going to be okay. After that, we're going to need to import just a few more things. So we're going to import Drizzle, and this comes from the Drizzle ORM / PlanetScale serverless. And then we're going to need to import the schemas we created. So quotes, authors, and categories are all going to be imported from @/db/ and now this comes from schema. There we go. And now one more, we need to import the EQ, which means equal function, from Drizzle ORM, and we just stop there. So not like the Drizzle ORM / PlanetScale serverless we had above. With all of the imports complete, let's just type RFC. I'm using my React ES7 snippets here. Press tab and I get export default. I need to add here a sync function, which is going to be get all quotes. And now that we have the quote type we created in our types.d.ts file, I can say this is going to return a promise. It's going to be an array of quotes because we're getting all the quotes. And of course, this return is not accurate at all. We will not be returning any JSX here. So to connect to the database, we say const con to define our connection, and we use connect, and we pass in the config we imported. After that, we'll say const db for database, and we'll set this equal to drizzle, and there we pass in our connection. Now let's query the database with Drizzle. So I can define the results, and we expect the results to be an array of quotes. I'm going to set this equal to await db.select, but now we're not just going to use a select. I mean, if we just wanted to get everything from the table, we wouldn't pass anything into the select. But we need to specify what we want. So we want a quote, and that's going to come from the quotes table and the quote column. An author is going to come from the authors table, the author column, and you might guess the same for the categories table and the category column. So we're being very specific what we want to get back from this query of the database, this select statement. So now we need to join these tables as we would with an SQL query. So here I'll say dot from, and it's going to be from the quotes table. Then we can say dot inner join, and we'll say the authors table. Here's where we use that EQ function we imported, and we say quotes dot author ID, and then needs to be equal to authors dot ID. And now this will be very similar for categories. So we'll also say dot inner join here, have categories, once again, equal to quotes dot category ID, and this would be categories dot ID. That would be our full query that would be equal to what we used earlier inside of the console of PlanetScale to get those results where we had the quote, author name, and category name. And now you can see TypeScript is telling us all we're missing is really the return value. So let's just return the results. Now there's our library function. We'll be able to use this for a route.ts file that we would use for the REST API endpoint, but then we'll also go ahead and use it in our own application, the front end of our Next.js application, where we can get this data from the PlanetScale database and present our randomly changing quote on the homepage. And I say that, but this is actually the one we're only going to use in the REST API because it's returning all quotes. Now let's go ahead and create our getRandomQuote library function as well. So we can do that with a new file and say getRandomQuote.ts. Okay, we're in the new file, but let's go back to our get all quotes here. And it looks like I need to save this, but also we want all of the same imports that we're using in get all quotes to be in the get random quotes file as well. So I'll just copy all of those, now paste them here inside of the getRandomQuote.ts file. Notice we had get all quotes plural, but this is getRandomQuote singular. Now let's come down, once again use React ES7 snippets here. Try that again, press tab, and now we have our getRandomQuote function, and much like the predecessor, it's a promise, but this will just be a quote, not an array of quotes, because it's once again singular. We can get rid of the return. Let's jump back to our get all quotes once again, because this is going to be very similar to what we were doing before. So we'll connect once again, connect the same, and we'll actually run the same query to get all of the quotes because we'll have all of those before we randomly decide which one to return. So now let's go back to the getRandomQuote, and we'll once again make that same request here with Drizzle, and we can see we need to make this an async function also. And so all of that code is the same. But now we need to make just a few changes. And one of those things is to actually keep track of some state outside of the function. And that's because it would be possible to press the refresh quote button and randomly get the same quote again. And we really don't want that to happen. So we can keep track of something outside of the function. So in that regard, the lexical scope, essentially, we can say, hey, don't return the quote if it's the same one we had before. So to do that, I'm going to say const, and I'm going to call this the previous quote object. I'm going to set this equal to an object here, and I'm essentially going to set up some state like we would with use state, but it's essentially out of the function. So I'm just going to say previous, I'm going to set that equal to 1, and I'm going to have a set previous function, which is a function. It's going to receive a number. And now after that, inside of the function, we'll just say this dot previous equals that number. So that will set the previous value. Now let's scroll down inside of our function here. And of course, we need just a little bit extra room after our query. And yep, that looks good. So let's go ahead and put something over here that will help us determine that random number. So I'll say let random index is what we'll call this variable. I'm just going to set it equal to the previous quote object dot previous, of course, because that's the value. And now let's set up a while loop. And this will just say while random index is equal, and we'll do a strict equals to previous quote object dot previous. We'll keep looping through because we don't want it to be equal to whatever the previous choice was. And now inside the loop, we'll set the random index equal to math.floor, and we'll call math.random, and we'll take that times the result, not results, is it? Just result or results? Let me double check that. It's results, so results dot length. So this should select a random number. We just don't want that same random index of the array to be what it was before. And if it is equal to that, it's going to keep looping through so it doesn't proceed further and deliver that same quote again. Let me move this curly brace over. There we go. That looks better. And now all we need to do after the loop is complete, because the index number is not the same, we'll just say previous quote object dot set previous, so we know what it is next time, the random index. Remember, all of this code's running on the server, and we'll say return result, and we'll just pass in this random index right there. So that would be our random quote. I said result once again. It's results. There we go. Results random index, which would give us one quote. So if we mouse over this, we can see it's an array of quotes, but now we're passing in that one index just to get that one specific quote from that array. And that should complete our second library function. So now we can get the random quote and we can get all quotes. And the get random quote is the one we'll use on our front end. With the library functions complete, let's scroll up to the app directory. And inside the app directory, we want to create an API directory. Now inside the API directory, we're going to create a directory for each of our routes that we're going to have. So let's create one here called quotes that will return all the quotes. So inside this directory, we're going to have a route.ts file. Now we're going to import, and we'll have next response from next server. And after that import, we're also going to import our get all quotes function that we just created inside of the library directory. Now let's say export async function, and it's going to be a get request or a get endpoint here. And then we'll have the request. And after that, this will be very simple. We'll just say const quotes equals await get all quotes. Now we should have all the quotes, so we'll say return next response.json, and we'll pass those quotes in. That is our complete endpoint here for this API. This should return all of the quotes. Now the next one we create is going to be almost identical, so we'll Control A to copy all the code, Control C, I guess Control A to select, Control C to copy. Now with the API directory once again, I'm going to create another directory inside of it. I'm going to name this directory random. We don't even need the dash. I'll just call it random quote, all one word. And now inside of this directory, I'll put another route.ts file. I'll paste in the code that we just had, but instead of get all quotes, we're going to import get random quote from our @lib get random quote file. There we go. So just changing a couple of things on the import. Likewise, we're going to use that same function down here, and we should be able to get a random quote, and we could just call this quote, even though we wouldn't have to change it, but that makes more sense. And we can save that. Now we've completed both endpoints, and we're ready to try them out. I'm going to use the Thunder Client extension as it's built right into VS Code, and you can see the logo over here. Search for Thunder Client and extensions if you want to use what I'm using, but you could also use Postman or several other extensions that do the same thing. So I'm going to have a GET request, and I believe I've basically already created it before. And so here I'm looking at localhost 3000, which would be our application API quotes. Now, what I haven't done yet, I'm just thinking about this, is actually start our Next.js application. So let's type npm run dev to make sure it gets up and running and is ready to receive requests. Okay, so it says it's running now on localhost 3000. That's good. Close the terminal window. This is going to hit that quotes endpoint, and we should get all of the quotes back along with their authors and categories. Let's give it a try. I'll click send. Processing. Let's see what we get back. And here are the results. So I will scroll this up, and we have an array of quotes. And it looks like everything we wanted. Remember, this didn't come from our local environment. This went out and connected to PlanetScale already and brought it back. So we know everything is connecting and working like it should. We've got our Drizzle ORM in there connecting to PlanetScale. It's all good. We're getting the data we want. Now let's change this quotes endpoint to our random quote endpoint. And let's send once again. And we just get one quote back. Notice it's not an array. It's just an object with the one quote. Let's send it again to see if we get a different one. Yep, different quote, different quote. So everything is working as we expect it to. With the API routes working already, we know everything we've implemented is working. Our functions with Drizzle and PlanetScale. So basically what's left is creating the front end, and you may or may not be interested in that. It's got just a little bit of tailwind in there. Let's go ahead and make those changes, and I'll do it fairly quickly as well. Let's go to the layout.tsx that's just inside of the app folder along with the main page here. I'm just going to change this metadata. So I've highlighted everything that was there, and you can see I've changed it now to random quote machine. This page generates a random quote is the description. Now we're going to change what we're returning here, which is basically HTML and the body. We want to go ahead and add just a little bit more to that and wrap it around the children. So let's go ahead and do that. And all I'm going to do is add an extra main element here inside of the body that wraps around the children. And it's got a few Tailwind classes applied to it. And I can go ahead and press Alt-Z, and remember, I will be linking to all of the source code in the description as well, so you could grab all of this there if you want. But there are the class names that I'm applying to the main element inside of this layout component. Now let's go to the page TSX that is right beside it. Now the default page, of course, comes with a lot of information. So really, I'm just going to select all of that with Control-A, hit backspace, get rid of everything there, paste in my very simple page. Now we haven't created the quote component yet. You can see I'm going to keep it in components and /quote, but this is the home page. This is the server page. Now the quote component itself is going to be a client page, so the user can refresh the page whenever they want to. That's, of course, some interaction right there that they're taking. So we're going to make that a client component. But the rest of this, you get random quotes, this is going to be server-side rendered. So it's issuing this request from the server, which is also a good discussion here because we did create API routes, but you don't want to set up your server component to request from your API route in the same Next app, because whatever data the server component requests needs to be available at build time, and it can't be available if you're also building your route. So I just wanted to highlight that. I've been asked that a few different times. You could request from an API route in your client component, but not your server component. That will cause a build error. Let's once again create a directory inside of the app directory now, and we'll call this components. Imagine the app might have more in the future. We're just going to create one here, and it is going to be a file called quote.tsx. As I mentioned, this will be a client component, so we need the use client directive at the top. Then I'm going to add some code here, and if you haven't seen this before, you possibly have if you've worked with Next.js, because you usually see it in the default layout. I'll come back to this real quickly, because they have this enter font right here from next/font/Google. Some of them, of course, enter isn't one. It doesn't require that much for configuration, but I'm using a couple of fonts here that just have a little bit more configuration. So I've got Roboto and Poppins, and you can see I've imported them both above. So I'm just using two different Google fonts here. Now I'm going to scroll for a little room, and we're going to need a couple of hooks as well. So I'm importing useRouter from next/navigation and useState from React. Now let's go ahead and create the quote function. I'll type RFC again with my ES7 React snippets. It says export default function, and it's got quotes. So that is what we need. Of course, the return will be different, so I'll go ahead and delete that. Now this is going to receive the random quote, so we need to put that right here, random quote, and it is a type quote that we previously created. Let's go ahead and initialize those hooks so we can see we're defining router with useRouter, and then we've got a fade and set fade with useState, initially set to false. Now this is just for that CSS fade in, fade out that you saw at the beginning of the video when we're getting those random quotes. It essentially helps me switch the Tailwind classes. Let's scroll for a little bit of room, but underneath these hooks, I'm going to go ahead and start the return, put the parentheses here, and we're going to have a section that wraps around everything. So let me Alt-Z so we can see all of that at once, and I need to put in the closing section here. You can see it's got several Tailwind classes on it, and here's where I'm using the fade from the useState. So essentially, if it's true, we're setting the opacity to 0, and if it's false, we're setting it to 100. And a lot of this does the animation here as well. So we've got the transition opacity, ease in, out. The duration is 1 second. The duration is going to be important so you get that little bit of darkness, and you'll see how I apply the rest of that with the on click in the button here in just a second. But this section is wrapped around everything. Now we're going to have two different divs inside of this section, one for the big quote and one for the button and where we have the author and the category. So putting in the author and the category first, this is going to appear to be a lot, but we can go over this quickly because it's not that bad. And if I save, we'll get a little formatting. So now we have a div here inside of the section. It's our first div, and the first thing we have is a button. Now here's how the timing works on that animation. So the duration on the fade out is 1 second, and we set the fade to true when we click. So it begins to fade out for 1 second. Basically, at the same time that fade out is over, we call router refresh from Next.js, and that refreshes the page. Now, when that happens, we've already got it set to true here. So what's going to happen then, or we don't refresh the full page, essentially we're refreshing that data, but what Next.js router refresh does, because we're still using useState, and now useState comes back and sets itself to false just 200 milliseconds essentially after this set timeout, because if they were both 1,000, they'd be equal. And so we just need that little space of time where we have a dark screen before it fades back in. So milliseconds, they look big when you say 1,000 and 1,200, but it's actually really fast. So that's the refresh quote button here in the on click. And of course, you can once again see the different Tailwind classes. Then down below, we have the author and the category as well, and I could separate those so you could see both, and that's all inside the first div. Then we're going to have the big quote here in the next div. And in comparison, the big quote looks fairly simple. It is set to grow as we have a flex box, and we want the big quote to take up most of the page, so it fills out the rest of that page. And you can see it's much larger with the text-5XL class name here, and it's using the Roboto text. But overall, that is the full quote page, and so this all pulls it together. And besides the logic kind of in that fade, Not much new there, but we're using that same data. We're just passing in the random quote that we get from the parent server component that is an SSR, a server-side rendered, and essentially just passes it into that quote component that we have there. So if we come back to the page, here's the SSR that I'm talking about, and we pass that random quote in. Let's go ahead and save this page, and I think we can open up the terminal and confirm that this is still running. So now let's open up localhost 3000 and check out our application. So there it is. I'm going to control-click, open that in the browser, and let's check out our app. There's our first quote. Let's see if the button's working and we get a new one. Yep, there's our next quote. So everything is working as expected. I hope this app and creating this project, a short little one, helps you understand how you can quickly create a MySQL database on the serverless PlanetScale. That's pretty cool, and it's very fast. We're getting this data back very quickly. Remember, that's not in our dev environment. It's reaching out to PlanetScale. And then it introduced Drizzle ORM, which, by the way, isn't even on version 1 yet. It's in the very early stages, but it's already pretty good. So you might want to play around with that as well. And then once again, just another Next.js project to get you a little more familiar with how you might want to do things inside of Next.js when working with an ORM and a database. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.